So, once again, let's talk about power. What does power entail? What does understanding a society entail? What does being part of a community entail? So, we often don't think about this very often, and sometimes it's for good reason. It becomes a little bit disconcerting when we start to question what, the rules are in society. I think we can start by, let's just take an easy one that isn't necessarily connected with society, but that is connected with sort of what we've been talking about when it comes to language and communication. If you begin to really think about when you are speaking with your friends, when you're talking with your family, when you're talking in class, if you begin to think about the fact that, do you know where your sentence is going to end once you've begun it? Do you know exactly the sequence of words you're going to say when you start speaking? It's really hard to parse that, right? It's very difficult for us when we consider, when I start speaking, do I know in 20 seconds where I'm going to be in a conversation? In many cases, no, because we're responding to and reacting to the things that are happening around us. But do we even know exactly the way that we're going to end our sentences? Do I know that at the end of the sentence I'm going to say a certain word or another word? I think it's really difficult to say, right? We don't process information in that way. It's one of the reasons why learning a foreign language can be very difficult, right? Because all of a sudden, with a foreign language, you really need to know, right? We start a sentence and we know exactly where we're going because we've created the sentence specifically to say it, because we're learning a language, right? And as we build fluency in a foreign language, it often then becomes there is a steep cliff, right, at a certain point during our language learning process where we realize we have to be able to either figure out how to do that or be comfortable with the fact that we are not as fluent as we may want to be because we're still thinking sentence by sentence by sentence by sentence, right? I think it's a really fascinating starting point because I think it allows us to right away consider what the implications of that kind of mentality are in the rest of society, right? Um, let's move on to something else that does not take place necessarily in Jean Genet's The Balcony, which we are going to be reading next week and then the following week. But let's think about money. When we think about money, when we think about the value of anything, it has value because we give it value, right? Now, certainly, it has value because we give it value does not hold up very well if, for example, somebody gives us $100 bill, we light it on fire and simply say, no, that's meaningless, it's worthless, it's useless, it doesn't mean anything. Because we know very well if we take that $100 bill, we can do something with it, right? But we can only do something with it because society as a whole has agreed that that piece of paper printed by the Treasury has a certain value that can be exchanged against a certain amount of goods, right, and services. But again, why? What makes that the case? Why is that the case? Why do we agree? Did we have any say in that? No, or maybe unless you happen to be part of a group of people who's controlling money, we had no say in it, right? When we are handed money or when money shows up in our account, in fact, when money shows up in our account that's electronic that we never see, how do we know what the value of it is? Well, we just simply have come to accept it, right? If we start to question those values, start to question that ethic, right, that becomes really complicated. I think when it then moves on to something like political power, when it then moves on to something like, societal agreement of what is and is not acceptable, we move a step further into a territory where things become a little bit frightening, perhaps, for us, right? Because now we've gone from, right, we understand that, right, words have meaning, and that words have meaning because people have agreed that they have meaning, and that when we speak to people, we've joined into this community of speakers of a language that agree that these words mean this, these words mean that, and we can communicate with those words, right? And that we can learn words in other we can make other sounds with our mouths that will also convey meaning in other languages, right? And I think, with the bald soprano, what we just saw, we see where that can be taken to an extreme limit, right? Where suddenly words that individually make sense can be put together in such a way that they don't make sense and that things become very tenuous, right, when it comes to communication. We move from that to money. Does it really exist? Does a quarter, right? Why, when I put it into a machine, does it actually do the thing that I want it to do? Why have we agreed that that is the case? Why have we agreed that two pieces of paper, identical except for the printing, are worth the price of a candy bar, right? I can buy a candy bar maybe with one of them, and with the other one, I can buy a whole lot more, right? With this currency. And in many cases, I don't even see it. It just happens to exist on a card and a chip in my pocket. When we then move on, right, to agreements in society about what is and is not right, about what is and is not acceptable, this moral code, this code that we've come up with, Genet decides he wants to start questioning it. He wants to start saying, well, what if? What if, right? And of course, all the great plays, I think, start with the idea of the what if, right? What if, right, two rival houses in Verona have two members that decide to fall in love with each other? What happens then? Well, Shakespeare tells us, right? And why is that not an acceptable thing to happen? Why is there a tragedy? Well, because, again, we understand this idea of rival factions, about rivals, right, who do not want to have anything to do with each other and who actively wish each other harm. Right? A lot of stories are born from this idea that conflict between rivals is something that is, as old as time itself, and we can't ever, get beyond it because we still keep telling these stories to this day. So when we look at Genet and his idea about what power really is and what society really can do and say about power, I think it's really nice and it's really important to pay attention to the way that we react, especially to this particular play, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in our next video.